Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm just switching off. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, A Bruised Mind, Coercive Control and Women's Mental Health. I'm Beena. I'm a psychiatrist and psychotherapist. I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Women's Mental Health Special Interest Group. Our other co-chair, Dr. Ruth Reed, cannot be here with us, but she's played, because of personal circumstances, but she's played a very key role in conceptualizing and planning this webinar. Let's start with housekeeping. If anyone has any questions, please write them in the Q&A box. Both our speakers will address them after the second speaker's talk. If you want to interact with others, if you want to write any comments, please use the chat box. The college will send you the recording and the certificates at a later date. Your experience is very important for us, so please fill in the feedback forms. You'll find the link in the chat box. So starting the webinar, this topic of coercive control and women's mental health. Today is International Women's Day. It's such a beautiful experience, such a joyful experience to be a woman, and it's such a privilege to be a consultant psychiatrist. But those of us who are working with women patients know that we don't have a lot to celebrate. During this pandemic, we've seen an escalation in the rates of domestic abuse. Domestic abuse has been the shadow pandemic. And domestic abuse is a gendered violence. Both men and women experience domestic abuse. However, it's women who tend to experience the more repetitive, severe forms of domestic abuse, including sexual violence. 77% of the victims of domestic abuse homicides are women. Women who experience domestic abuse are 3 times more likely to develop severe and enduring mental health problems. When we are speaking about domestic abuse, we're not just talking about physical violence. We know that what lies at the heart of domestic abuse is coercive control. That is sometimes not visible, sometimes not seen by the external world. Yet it creates such a dark chain, an invisible chain that creates such a sense of deep fear that pervades every aspect of a woman, her being, her psyche, her self-esteem, and it has devastating impact on a woman's mental health. Yet this topic is poorly understood and sometimes not detected. If it's detected, sometimes there isn't clarity about what to do. So the objective of this webinar is twofold. We want to enhance our knowledge on coercive control, and we also want to have pointers on what to do. We've lined up 2 excellent speakers, Dr. Philippa Greenfield and Professor Jane Monkton-Smith. Let me start with introducing the first speaker, Dr. Philippa Greenfield. She's a consultant psychiatrist in London. She's also her trust lead for trauma-informed domestic abuse. She's also the Islington Domestic Abuse Ambassador. Throughout her career, Philippa has built a passion and expert in domestic abuse. She also leads in the working group, national working group, that looks at those who are in services, who are accessing services, and who are perpetrators of domestic abuse. Philippa is also an executive member of our Women's Mental Health Special Interest Group. We have the Violence Against Women and Girls Working Group, which has 3 strands, and Philippa leads with the domestic abuse strand. Philippa is going to be joined by Jessie C., who works in the same trust. Jessie is a part of the Awareness and Response to Domestic Abuse Network. Jessie has lived experience, so any pointers, any advice that she gives us professionals will be hugely valued. Over to the both of you.
Just sharing my screen, which I think you'll now be able to see. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Bina, for the introduction. And also, I just really wanted to start by saying thank you to Jessie for joining me today to talk with everybody and to share her own expertise. As Bina said, I am first and foremost a clinician. I am a general adult psychiatrist working with people with ongoing need related to serious mental illness. My work and interest in inequality, trauma, particularly in the form of domestic abuse, and their links to the development of mental health conditions has come directly from work with this patient group, listening to their stories, educating myself, and I hope through doing so, developing a better understanding of the challenges and need. Jessie and I have 20 minutes to speak to you today about this incredibly important, complex, and as Bina said, so often misunderstood subject. So when considering what to speak to you about, we decided we'd focus on three main messages that we would like you as psychiatrists to take away from this today. So firstly, why is it so important that we as psychiatrists have an understanding of domestic abuse, particularly today focusing on coercive control? How should we be asking the questions? And finally, how can we use our understanding of trauma to inform an appropriate response? So as Bina touched on already, I really want to start by acknowledging that domestic abuse is a major public health issue. It can affect anybody, however, we know that we are not all affected equally. Today is International Women's Day, and it's important that we acknowledge that domestic abuse is a gendered crime. It's thought to affect 1 in 4 women globally, and we know that women and girls are most likely to experience the most serious harms and death as a consequence. As I will go on to speak further about, power and the misuse of power essential to domestic abuse. So again, when I say that we are not all impacted equally, it's so important therefore that we take an intersectional approach when considering the forms of harms experienced and also the impacts of these. I've just brought here for reference an example, the important report by Khan in 2020, which described the disproportionate impact on Black and minoritized women of the dual pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, on the backdrop of the ongoing pandemic of violence against women and girls that was declared by the World Health Organization in 2013. So I want to move on. Why as psychiatrists should we be concerned about domestic abuse? Well, firstly, we know that it has, and most importantly, we know it has severe and lasting impacts on somebody's mental health and also physical health, as well as other outcomes. But obviously for the audience today, I'll be focusing on physical health and the mental health and the mental health impacts. We know that those accessing mental health services are much more likely to have experienced domestic and sexual abuse, but also that that population is much more likely to go on to have further experiences of victimization. We know that domestic abuse has a psychological impact and is associated with the development of mental health conditions across the spectrum, thinking about anything from the diagnosis of depression, PTSD, to severe and enduring mental illness, such as bipolar affective disorder and schizophrenia. And not only do we know that those with serious mental illness will likely have experienced high levels of trauma and adversity before accessing services or receiving a diagnosis, but we also know and must recognise that so often their pathways to care, which may often involve police, restraint, and accessing our most restrictive parts of the mental health service and settings, and experiencing distressing symptoms can further add to and compound experiences of trauma. I also want to acknowledge and highlight here how we are increasingly understanding the links between domestic abuse and suicide. And this knowledge is only growing as we truly start to collect data. And again, examples of our learning through the process of domestic homicides reviews here has been invaluable. And I would also like to signpost about some really important work that's been going on in Kent and Medway Trust in this area too. And what I'm particularly interested in myself and wanting to mention when we think about the importance here and the relevance to the people that we see, and particularly the population with whom I work, is the unique type of experience, the unique type of trauma experienced in domestic abuse. Here we're not talking about a single trauma, but instead trauma that is prolonged and ongoing. And we must also consider, in thinking about that, the role of isolation. I've put a quote here from Judith Herman, the American psychiatrist, who in her work on trauma and recovery says it describes how the core experience of psychological trauma is disempowerment and disconnection from others. And it's really important here to reflect, when we think about isolation, how we still don't talk about domestic abuse in society. We still don't talk about it within our profession, and we still do not ask the questions of those seeking help from us. And all alongside this, whilst remembering the tactics of coercion and control that we're going to be talking about further today, are already working to isolate, disempower, and compound feelings of shame. So what is coercive control? So it's a form of domestic abuse, as Sabina started us off saying today. And I've put up here for you to look at the cross-government definition of both controlling behaviour and coercive behaviour. But in looking at that, I want to put simply, as explained by Women's Aid, it can be thought of as a persistent pattern of controlling and coercive or threatening behaviour that may include all forms of domestic abuse, including, for example, emotional, financial, and sexual abuse. And it acts to trap women or victims in relationships and make it impossible or dangerous for them to leave. And this is really important for us to understand, because I think so often when we think about domestic abuse or consider risk, we ask and look for violence, and doing so can be misleading. And I'm going to bring up here, which some of you may be familiar with and others not. If not, please do go away and have a look at this further. But this is a power and control wheel. And I've put this up here because really, as I say, just to explain what's going on and what we might be thinking about when we're looking at domestic abuse and really understanding what that means. In the middle sections, you can see going around the circle, we have descriptions of some of the tactics that are so often used in coercive and control. And ultimately, these tactics are used to gain power. So as this really illustrates here, in order to truly understand domestic abuse, we have to understand that at the centre, it's about a person or people gaining power and control over another. This process takes time. Patterns of abuse are so often established over years. And I think, as outlined, you see physical and sexual violence at the edges of this circle. And I think what this is showing us, that if we are seeing sexual or physical violence, this is often the tip of the iceberg, and think about what really must make us think about what else is going on. And why is it so important for us to understand this and look at this wheel? It tells us that there doesn't need to be violence for serious harm to be caused in terms of the psychological impact or trauma of domestic abuse, but also in terms of the effects of isolation, disempowerment, loss of agency, financial harms that people might be experiencing. It tells us that when violence does occur in the context of domestic abuse, it's not a one-off act. It's not about a loss of control or having anger management problems. If it would, we'd see more acts of Hello, can you hear me? Thank you. Sorry, I lost everybody. I don't know why. But I was saying about understanding the power and control wheel, and I'm going to bring up that slide again. Apologies. Okay. It also tells us, as I was saying, it tells us that it's not a one-off act when violence occurs, but it's not a one-off act when violence occurs. And also, as Jane will tell us more about in the second part of this webinar today, coercive control, even without a history of violence or aggression itself, can be a risk, is a risk factor for homicide and also for suicide. And if power and misuse of power are central to domestic abuse, we have to understand the impact of inequality, where power lies and how it can be used, which brings us back to the idea of needing to use an intersectional lens and the need to consider the inequalities people may experience based on other protected characteristics, such as sexual orientation, age, disability, gender reassignment, that can all be targeted in domestic abuse. I'm going to move on now to say a little bit about what we know about mental health responses to domestic abuse. Well, we know, and we see time and time again, that we still don't ask the questions, and that clinicians still don't see this as a health problem, and more see it as a social problem that other people should be thinking about and sorting out. Data collection remains inconsistent, and again, learning from domestic homicides has really brought some of these points to focus. We also know that factors directly related to domestic abuse and the consequences of domestic abuse can be barriers in themselves to individuals seeking care they need from mental health services. So how do we ask the questions? And for those of you who haven't heard of this concept, although I hope most of you will, routine inquiry is a process, is the name given to the process of asking everybody that we see in our services about their experiences of harm from others, and is considered best practice for mental health professionals. And as I've put here, in fact, it has been the Department of Health, it's been Department of Health policy since 2003 that we should be asking, but we still don't. And I use the word sensitive routine inquiry really to emphasise it's not just about asking the questions, but about how we ask them. Do we consider the language we use? I've put some general examples people might feel familiar with. Are you feeling safe at home? Are you feeling frightened of anybody? But also, are we asking in a way that suggests that we want to hear the response? Are we asking with expectation that somebody should not have to tell us, recognising that this may take time and relies on so many factors, in particular trust and safety? And are we considering if it's safe to ask the questions at that time? And I particularly think about this at the moment as we're using more and, well, I suppose less and less face-to-face interactions and relying on digital technology and telephone for our assessments and contact. But also, even if it is face-to-face, is the space we're using private, and does that person feel safe to speak? And also, are we considering things that are so important, such as our environment? Is that creating a safe space? Is the environment that we're speaking to people in, making people feel able to tell us difficult things? And again, I suppose what comes to mind in thinking about this, about our traditional, in psychiatry, our traditional ward round settings, which may have multiple people all firing questions at one person who is using the service. And I also want to raise here that in asking the questions, we really must be open about as to the forms of domestic abuse that people may experience and the different forms this can take. And in doing so, considering the communities who we serve. For example, we might be asking and thinking about intimate partner violence, but in so-called honour-based violence, there may be multiple perpetrators. And we also may need to be thinking about the presence of child-parent abuse. I put this slide up here and really wanted to acknowledge that asking somebody and somebody telling us about coercive control can be more complicated. I've put some examples here of the ways that we might ask questions. But again, do come back and look further at this slide or other resources that you may have access to. But just to give a guide of the sorts of things you might be interested in or might want to ask when we're thinking about the presence of coercive control. thinking about whether somebody has access to their own money, who makes important decisions in their family, and understanding issues of child contact. But it's not just about us asking alone. It's also thinking about what we observe of the wider picture. For example, does someone always attend appointments with somebody else? Is somebody speaking on their behalf? Or is there evidence that in other ways somebody is having their choices limited? But again, so I'm not going to be focusing today on specific guidance of how we respond, but rather thoughts that we must consider in our response. So again, as a starting point for any response, we must consider how coercion and control can manifest in society, in our own services and practices. Do we risk replicating experiences of control and disempowerment through our response? And if so, what can we do to mitigate this? There are some really positive things that we can do. We can validate and we can believe what somebody has told us. We can and should always seek to offer options of support, bearing in mind that if somebody has had choices taken away from them for so long, concrete choices can be helpful. And a really important note for us all, do we know what support is available so that we can offer that? Any safeguarding procedures should be led as much as possible by the person. What do they feel they need to help keep themselves safe? Taking time to understand somebody's situation and wishes. Information sharing and processes, again, should be as open and transparent as possible. If we need to share information, what information are we sharing, who with, and why? We should seek to gain consent where possible. And if there are times that we have to override this, for example, if there are children involved or really felt to be immediate danger, have we really thought carefully about the need to do this? And are we explaining why we're making these decisions and how we will keep somebody informed? We have to recognise that somebody has likely been walking on eggshells and carefully negotiating their own safety for such a long time, and therefore need to be mindful in any actions that we take that we don't undermine this. It's really important to say that this may therefore, maybe for us, about resetting our own expectations. It may well, and often does, make us feel anxious or frustrated that somebody doesn't choose to leave a situation that's recognised as harmful. But as Jane will talk more about today, this may well not be the safest option, but also we have to consider what's really at stake, whether that leaving a situation is losing all contact with friends and family, losing home, losing work. And as I will always hold in mind from a survivor who I did some joint training with some years ago, and how she told me that despite leaving a violent and abusive relationship over 10 years ago, she had never and believes she will never vote, given the concern she would have of sharing information that would allow her to vote and being contacted. And I want to move on now. And again, I'm not going to go through this in detail because I want to hand over to Jessie, but I want to just say that something really important, that again, a truly effective response is not just about what we do as individuals, but it's about systems working together and in a way that supports professionals in doing this work. So I really want you to take a moment just to think about what you feel you need in your organisation to really make changes in your response, whether this is about skills and training, whether it's about starting to really collect the data so that we understand the issues in our organisation and where we work and the people we work with. Is it about building better partnership working or developing support structures for staff to support them working in this very challenging area? Or is it about our organisational culture? Is this is this an organisation that promotes sharing and learning? And at the bottom of this, because as I say, I'm not going into specific guidance, but I just really wanted to highlight a few of the really helpful resources that you can all go to as clinicians looking for guidance and best practice in this area. And I've put those there. So in particular, I've highlighted the Violence and Mental Health Network, which is co-led by our colleague, Professor Louise Howard, and some fantastic resources for clinicians there. Also the the NICE guidance, the Pathfinder toolkit, which I've referenced above, which is a fantastic guidance for staff working in this area about best practice, and also the Safe Lives website. But I'm now going to hand over to Jessie to speak from a survivor's perspective as to why our responses as professionals are so important.
Thank you, Philippa. The way mental health services formulate and consider risk is often at odds with the way survivors feel about their own safety. The traditional valuation of risk in 3 domains, risk to self, risk to others, and risk from others, compartmentalizes and fragments risk, when really we should be thinking about questions of safety globally and holistically. From a survivor's point of view, risk to self and risk from others are not separate, but inextricably linked and 2 parts of a much greater whole. To prevent the further fragmentation of risk across different services, it's imperative to recognise that risk posed by domestic abuse is no less the concern of mental health services than risk posed by mental ill health. It's clear so far that power and control lie at the very heart of domestic abuse. We also need to consider the power hierarchies and power imbalances already implicit within mental health services, and so actively seek to empower survivors and amplify their voices within safeguarding processes. Expressions of validating and believing are so important when responding to disclosures, because this will help to put the survivor at ease and enable them to say more. On the contrary, without this, a survivor might feel intense feelings of fear and shame, which can close down the conversation. The language we use is also important. Safeguarding itself is quite a complicated and tricky concept, and it's important to explain what safeguarding is to a survivor and to share the knowledge you might have about abuse and about safeguarding, because this is in itself an act of empowerment which can hand that control back to the survivor. Many survivors describe feeling powerless, with a lack of agency over their lives following abuse. And this is why it's so important to offer choice and to really respect the survivor's own expert knowledge of their own situation and of their own safety. When disclosures are handled without validation and without choice, and when things are done for the survivor instead of with them, this can trigger feelings of fear, panic, and loss of control, which are in themselves evocative of the coercive control. If confidentiality must be broken against the survivor's wishes, it's so important to explain the thinking behind this and to really recognise how frightening this might be. This facilitates a space of psychological safety and also provides the model for a new kind of relationship in which the survivor is in control and their wishes respected and valued. Next slide, please. Philippa and I want to end with 3 key points for action. Firstly, to educate ourselves and our peers on how we can make our services better equipped to support survivors of coercive control. Secondly, we must act, and we must act now to start asking those questions and to embed routine inquiry into our daily practice. And also to hold ourselves and our peers to account when this isn't happening. Thirdly, to think about what support we need as individuals, but also on an organisational level and in our wider systems to make our services more trauma-informed, because we can never affect change if we work in isolation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you both. Some really helpful messages there, guys. Some really powerful messages about how we as professionals and the systems in which we work can be working towards identifying and responding to coercive control among our patients. So thank you. My name is Claire Wilson. I'm the Academic Secretary of the Women in Mental Health Special Interest Group. I'm also a psychiatry registrar and clinical lecturer in South London. And it's my great honour to introduce our next speaker. We were delighted when Professor Monckton Smith agreed to speak for us today. Jane Monckton Smith is a Professor of Public Protection at the University of Gloucestershire, and her specialisms are in homicide, coercive control and stalking, and actually she's recently authored a new theoretical model for tracking escalating risk in cases of coercive control, intimate partner stalking and domestic abuse. Her latest research focuses on so-called hidden homicides, so those sudden and unexpected deaths that are not acknowledged or recorded as suspicious, but have high risk antecedents. And today, she's going to be telling us a bit more about the stages of this coercive control that we've been talking about, and how it's relevant to patients who we may encounter in our clinical practice. So over to Jane. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, I think it's important to say that I am predominantly a homicide researcher. So what I'm going to be talking about today is in the context of escalating risk towards homicide. So the homicide timeline, as you can see from the slide there, is a particular piece of research focused on intimate partner risk and threat that could potentially end in homicide. And I'm going to talk about the basic method that we used. It's an established model for tracking risk and threat in cases of, other categories of homicide, but it had never really been used in intimate partner homicide because they've historically, popularly been seen as spontaneous and crimes of passion and somebody responding to an immediate provocation. So it was thought that perhaps there probably wasn't a predictive journey in these cases. But when we started looking at lots and lots of cases, 400 in fact for this research, we found that there was a very definite kind of predictive journey. So timeline sequencing is actually called temporal sequencing in academic terms, and the principle is that you look at a whole bunch of homicides, you identify the chronological sequence of events, and then you find a common sequence, and that's what we did. So out of those 400 cases, we found a common sequence of events, a common chronology. Now, there are other sequences for things like male confrontational homicide, serial killing, mass killing. There's even one for genocide. But like I said, it's the first time really that this has been applied in an intimate partner homicide, domestic homicide category. And we've also very recently applied it with some Home Office funding to domestic abuse related suicides and to honour killings. And all three of those categories are underpinned by coercive control and coercive controlling patterns. So understanding coercive control is in fact incredibly important in tracking the way these things can pan out. And I will be talking more about the perpetrator's psychology, if you like, or thinking, than I will about the victims. And the reason for that is because the victim's responses to coercive control are in fact entirely logical. That is not to say that the control itself and the abuse does not create trauma. That's not what I'm saying, but I am saying that the way that victims can behave in very high-risk situations is quite normal, and most of us would respond in exactly the same way. And maybe looking at things like battered women's syndrome, for example, don't really capture that. It's almost as if the victim's response is somehow strange or something that we can't understand, but we found that to be absolutely not the case. So just to put in some context here, back in 2012, a public consultation from the Home Office found that coercive control was in fact the best model for understanding domestic abuse, because around 60 to 80% of cases that come to the attention, certainly of the police and usually to other professionals, will be coercive control related. So this isn't kind of niche. This is very, very common. And as you can see at the bottom there, coercive control is also considered to be the most significant high-risk marker for serious harm and even homicide. So, you know, it's thinking about those two things together. This is part of the reason why coercive control as a pattern is now criminalised in the Serious Crimes Act of 2015. So the legislation is fairly new, and the language around coercive control is fairly new, but the patterns, there's absolutely nothing new about them. It's just the more research that's been done, the more understanding, the more survivors and victims who come forward, we've got a much better understanding of what's going on. So if coercive control is so important in understanding risk and threat and the responses to the control from survivors, we really should be able to identify coercive control when it's there. So, I mean, as has already been eloquently said in the previous presentation, coercive control, basically, if you just want to put it in a headline, is something that traps somebody in a relationship. It has been described as creating almost a kind of a hostage situation, and the tactics of control and abuse will manipulate compliance from the person being controlled, the victim, if you like. But we really do misunderstand it, and especially if you look at the way things are maybe reported in the media and things like that, it's sometimes seen, coercive control is sometimes seen as almost the sister offence to violent abuse. So, but that would be to completely misunderstand it. Now, I'm not trying to teach you what coercive control is. You probably have a good idea, but I do want to speak about how we defined it for this piece of research. And we did use the government definitions, and we did use the work of Professor Evan Stark, who kind of wrote the seminal work on coercive control. So the way that, this is just like a visual depiction of what coercive control looks like. So if you think about coercive control as the overarching pattern of behaviour, it is the abuse and it is the motivation. So the motivation is to control, and being controlled in various ways is abusive. So all of the tactics you can see underneath the umbrella there, lots of different ones, and certainly there are loads more. These are just some examples. Violence, for example, is an incredibly effective way to manipulate and control somebody and make them compliant. So is sexual abuse, so is financial abuse, psychological abuse. All of these things are tactics to actually achieve this control. And they work together to create compliance and subjugation. And I think one of the most important words that I certainly came across when talking to bereaved families is the word consequences. So, you know, when we're talking to victims who are being controlled, I think it's always important to say to them things like, what would happen if? What would happen if you left? What would happen if you didn't comply? Because then you find out what the consequences are that the victim might be guarding against. It may be that they're frightened of any number of these controlling tactics that you see underneath the coercive control umbrella. I am going to have to speak very quickly, but you will recognise, I know, that there are a lot of complexities in this. So I am just going to talk very broadly, and I'm going to talk about now each of the stages that represent an escalation in risk towards serious harm and potentially homicide. So I'll go through each stage individually and explain why that stage is there, what the perpetrator thinking is, and why there's been an escalation. So stage one of this timeline kind of says that the perpetrator is a type. So this is not about the individual dynamics between two people, because at this stage there is no victim. The focus here is completely on the person who is controlling. So they will usually have a history of behaving in that way before, because they do tend to be repeat and serial offenders. So that and that is underpinned by us having the domestic violence disclosure scheme. So we absolutely know that history is relevant. We also know that when somebody who is at stage one, which is already an escalation because they have more risk of being controlling and abusive than the general population, when they meet somebody, what we found was that everything tends to be speeded up. So they may move in together very early. There might be an early pregnancy, early declarations of love and that kind of thing. But we did speak to killers as well. And what seemed to be really important at this stage was commitment. So what they're actually pushing for in this stage, where their behaviour is very different to what it will become, is to get that commitment. And that commitment can be sort of interpreted from anything, really. For some people, it will be the first time you sleep with them. For some, it could be marriage. For some, it could be something as simple as, you know, you've gone on a sequence of dates with them. But it's that push for early commitment that is linked to their sense that they have a right to behave like this. So if you commit to them, they then have rights to control you. I have not, in this research at all, looked at why somebody might need so much control. There are some theories, but I really don't have time to talk about them right now. But possession and jealousy at a very early stage are high risk markers that this journey is going to turn into a coercive control, which is in fact stage 3. So stage 3 is what we might all recognize as a coercive controlling relationship. So it's the next stage, in fact, that raises the risk. So I won't spend a lot of time talking about this, and we have already spoken about that in the first presentation. But the 4th stage here is a trigger for things to escalate. Now, the single biggest trigger globally is separation. And you can understand that because the whole point of coercive control is to trap someone in a relationship. If they're breaking out from that entrapment, then that creates a very definite response from the controlling person. I have put some other triggers down there but I really don't have time to talk about them at the moment. But they're basically mainly linked to separation or big life change for that controlling person. So stage 5 is their response. And this will be a stage that can be incredibly frightening for a survivor or a victim. And it is their attempt to claw the control back. And they will use all manner of tactics to try and get that relationship, get that control back from the victim. That could be crying and begging, promises to change, violence, threats to kill, threats to suicide. Could be all sorts of things. Most domestic abuse perpetrators will never get beyond stage 5. They all get to stage 3. Most of them will get to stage 5. It is the very dangerous ones who will move beyond stage 5. So at stage 5, this is when we see monitoring, stalking and tracking of the victim. Now, this can be incredibly destabilizing. And I say that this monitoring, tracking, stalking, we say it's in stage 5, but it will have been evident throughout the relationship. It's just that the law does not recognize stalking until the relationship has ended, which will probably be addressed in post-separation abuse, which has been mentioned in the new domestic abuse bill. So somebody who's being monitored and tracked will be very, very nervous about being able to disclose, be able to be honest, because they will know that at some level what they say may get back. And then we've got to think about the consequences for them. So we get back to that question again: what would happen if you disclosed and this person found out? Stage 6 is when things get really dangerous, because if everything seems irretrievable or irreversible, the very controlling person will may start to think that punishment through resentment and that kind of thing is the only way. They may be thinking about taking their own lives. They may be thinking about taking their partner's life. And this is a stage where it's quite difficult sometimes to identify this stage unless you can get lots of data and lots of information from somebody. Now, the next stage is, so they go from homicidal ideation, in fact, to planning. Now, a lot of people are very surprised to hear that there is a planning stage, but in my research and in other research, certainly from the United States, we see levels of planning in over 80% of intimate partner homicides. So these are not spontaneous. So if you're speaking to a victim and they are concerned that they may lose their life or be seriously harmed, I really do think that needs to be taken very seriously, because that victim knows that perpetrator better than anyone else and knows exactly what they are capable of. They have been showing them throughout the relationship what they're capable of, because that's a very good control tactic. So the final stage is in fact a homicide. Now, this is the smallest number of offenders will get to stage 8, but a lot of them do. And it's enough numbers for us to be concerned. The statistics that we have around homicide in this context are probably telling us at least just half the story. My research has suggested that we say there's 2 deaths a week. I would say probably 10 deaths a week. So this is a much bigger problem than we actually acknowledge, and recognizing that the victim will probably have some kind of idea of how much risk they're at is something that we need to take very, very seriously. And it's not fanciful. And if we start to listen, we actually might be able to start saving some lives. Anyway, I think that's my 20 minutes. So I'm going to stop sharing. A whistle-stop tour of the 8 stages.
Thank you so much, Jane, for that amazing talk, really. And I got very, I don't know, I think the part I liked the most was when you said that behaviors make sense in the context in which they take place. I think that was very thought-provoking for me as a clinician, really. Thank you for that. So my name is Violeta Perez. I'm a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist, and I'm also a member of the Women and Mental Health Special Interest Group. And I've been keeping an eye on the Q&A box. So I'll read some questions out loud for our panelists to discuss them. I'll wait for the panelists to be brought back. Brilliant. So we had a few comments on the chat just asking for some concepts to be clarified, but I'll start with the Q&A box questions. One of our attendees asked, should there not be a complete overhaul of our education of the male gender role from childhood? And they say maybe a bit utopic, but what do you all think?
Would you like me to start there? Yeah, I do think that a lot of this is based in our cultural belief systems and power relationships and hierarchies within relationships, absolutely, definitely, because the killers that I have spoken to and the families, bereaved families that I have spoken to, it seems that there is you know, when the control is taken away, there's a massive sense of injustice in this person, and they act on that sense of injustice because they feel society is telling them in their heads that they have the right to control their families. So I absolutely agree with that. We need to start with that, and we need to help people deal with rejection.
Definitely. And then we have a very interesting question as well that goes, how can one separate a culturally sanctioned coercive control from quote unquote pathological coercive control? Would you like to lead on this one as well?
Me? Okay. I mean, I'm not sure if you're asking that from a psychiatrist perspective. I can't answer as a psychiatrist, certainly, but I think that there has been some research done into the type of people who might be coercively controlling, and certainly they fall into different categories. So one of the categories, and this is not my research, but one of the categories is that a lot of these people may well have what we call antisocial personality disorder traits or characteristics where they lack empathy, they lack sympathy, they're very self-focused. But also there's another large group where which is called the dependent category, which is more about environmental triggers overlayered with cultural belief systems about entitlement to control. So not all of these abusers are the same. They're not all coming from the same place. The output is the same, though. This is the thing, and the threat and the risk is the same. Yeah.
Thank you. Then we have a question that's more clinical, that says, what should we be doing to protect victims if we have a client/patient that displays controlling behaviors beyond involving safeguarding teams for those that could be harmed by this? Maybe this is a good one for Philippa. what would you advise?
Yeah, hi. So yeah, I think a really good question. And I think as Ina mentioned, it's absolutely some of the work that a number of us are involved with, thinking about how we in healthcare really do address people who come to us who may be at risk of causing harm to others. And I think absolutely we do have a responsibility. It's a big question and lots of work going into how we should be responding. For me, and I suppose this is something I think, and probably at clinicians who are also here as well, this is something we are addressing. I mean, this is something that frequently within one of the services I work in, which is our GP facing service, I will frequently get people coming to the service who actually, the referral may say something about somebody presenting with anger management or difficulties with their emotion or a breakup that's affecting them. And these sorts of questions really come into the room. I suppose for me, I think it's really important that we don't ignore it, first of all. And if we, and really trying to open up and explore with somebody what they're bringing to us. I think that's really important because I think that we can so often be too frightened or too scared or think I can't go there to actually ask the questions. And actually, I think that what we do know, and we know a lot of this as well from work that was done in the sector of childhood sexual abuse and responding, we know, and also on reflecting on what Jane's telling us as well, we know something about the times when people might seek help, particularly around from mental health services. For example, thinking whether somebody's coming to us with suicidal thoughts or acts, often it's at the time there has been a trigger where something has happened. So you really do have a good opportunity to engage with somebody. They have come to you and they've asked for some help. And I think shutting down that discussion is really unhelpful. We're actually trying to encourage some discussion with them. It might be the one opportunity that you have to offer help. And again, what do you do with that? I mean, again, I can give some my thoughts on what I tend to do and the sorts of approaches I learn to, I suppose I'm learning to take. And I think the first thing to say is this is absolutely not something that people should be feeling on their own with, because it's incredibly complex. I think that I also want to, I suppose, in this answer, direct to some really important work done by Sandy Deanser from Bristol University, which is about how we really good work that looks at best practice in sharing and documenting information. And so people should really look at that. I think it's great. It's the first time that actually anybody's really brought that together, looking at what all of our professional guidance in this area about breaking confidentiality and sharing information, really bringing that together in one place. So just wanted to signpost that. But I think, again, often you can, starting to understand the problem for the person and what they might need is really important. It might not be, as is often the case for me as a general adult psychiatrist, people working in forensic settings may have a very different experience, but it might be acknowledging maybe at that moment in time there isn't it's not about a mental health problem, but actually it's about other sorts of supports or other issues. If you've got the opportunity, absolutely start to have a discussion with somebody about, and if they're open to this, and you can test it out in different ways, but will they see do they want to seek help for this behaviour? So if they're able to think about this, their behaviour might be causing harm to somebody else, offering things such as the Domestic Violence Intervention Project, which is available nationally, and unfortunately the commissioning of such services at a local level and resources is limited, but any other programmes that are aimed at perpetrators that people could be directed to. And also the Respect Hotline, a really important thing, again, directing people to that. I think that it's important. We have to remember as psychiatrists, one of the main tools that we have is our therapeutic engagement with somebody. I think it's very rare actually that we would have to break confidentiality. So I think a lot of what we can be doing is thinking about, do we need to share information? We have forums such as the MARIC, which are victim-led, but also MAPA if we need to, and allowing for multi-agency sharing if that's appropriate. We have our own safeguarding hubs to think about, where we can think about these issues and how we share information. Again, giving advice to the individual. And also one of the things that you can try to do, and again, if it's safe and if it feels welcomed by somebody in that discussion, is actually other things, if they're recognising they're posing harm to somebody, are the things that they think they can do to help keep somebody safe. For example, recognizing behaviors in themselves that may put somebody at risk. Somebody in the chat had mentioned again about the role of things such as substance misuse, for example, which we know isn't the cause of domestic abuse but can worsen it. So again, if people recognize these, that they're more at risk of causing harm when under the influence of substances or alcohol, directing to support around that and education can really help as well. So I suppose that's just a few ideas, and I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on that. And just also, again, really supporting building links with specialist services in the areas that you work. So again, in the trust that I work, we have partnership working with independent domestic violence advocates. We don't have partnership working with third sector specialists who work with perpetrators, and we don't have that provision in our area. But again, best practice would suggest that we do.
Brilliant, very helpful. Thank you, Philippa. And I guess we have time for maybe another quick question. The next one is also for Professor Monckton-Smith, and it goes, in the planning stage, what does isolating children mean / look like?
Right, in the planning stage, this is a particularly dangerous stage, and children should never be considered to be safe. And it should never be considered that the resentment or the response is only going to be directed at the former partner, because we know that that simply isn't true. And another thing that research has told us, that the most likely outcome for children, they can become collateral damage, they can be targeted, but the most likely outcome is that they'll witness it. So that, that kind of gives you an idea of the rigid thinking and the idea that this is about a general injustice, and anybody can become involved in that. And I think we don't listen to children enough either. And the family court system, when there are aggressive custody battles, for example. Now, in the family court system, it seems from the evidence that I've seen that a divorce is seen as just that. These people are bound to be arguing because they're getting divorced. And what we don't do is look and see, is there coercive control here? Because if there is coercive control, the family court battle is just an extension of that control, and it's not just about two people arguing. And I'm not saying that all custody battles are like that, but I have seen too many cases where the children have become actually collateral damage because they witnessed it, the most likely scenario, and tried to intervene. We have to be really careful.
Thank you. That's a very clear answer. I'm just mindful of the time, and I wouldn't want us to get cut off for running over the designated time. So we will have to bring this webinar to an end, unfortunately. I'm aware that many questions have not been answered, and what we will do is we'll try to give a reply to most of them after the webinar. I just wanted to thank all of our speakers for those brilliant presentations today. And also to Royal College for giving us a platform to speak about such an important topic. I think we've all learned a lot about how coercive control works, how it can underlie other types of abuse, and how it might not be the most visible part of the iceberg, but it's in a way at the base of everything else. Thank you also to everyone who joined us today or who's watching this on demand afterwards. And we wish you all a happy International Women's Day. Thank you very much. Take care.